So now we are going to introduce Fidelity Investments, joining us for the first time as our social justice keynote sponsor. Please welcome Tammy Rosas from Fidelity Investments, who will introduce our 2020 social justice keynote speaker, Dr. Juan Sánchez Muñoz, delivering his address, The Wisdom of Inclusion. After his address, we will take tweeted questions from our online audience using the hashtag EDC20@UNT. Please join me in welcoming Tammy Rosas and Fidelity Investments.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to get to be here with all of you today in order to learn about, discuss, collaborate about such an important topic for all of us to be thinking about on a going forward basis. And diversity and inclusion is something that is very important to Fidelity Investments. Both from a natural organic perspective, as well as what we can give back into our communities, as well as bringing new talent into our organization from a difference of schools of thought, schools of individuals, schools of opportunities. So we're very thrilled to be here, and I definitely appreciate Virginia Garza. I haven't seen her yet here, but for bringing us this opportunity to be a sponsor and to be here for the day in order to, more importantly, introduce our keynote speaker. So let me tell you a little bit about our keynote speaker. Very thrilled to be able to hear from him today. But Dr. Juan Sánchez Muñoz became the president of the University of Houston downtown in 2017. During his first year, Dr. Muñoz kicked off the university's largest capital campaign, led the institution's recovery efforts during Hurricane Harvey, facilitated increases in enrollment, retention, and graduation, and in addition of new degree programs. He received a $1 million grant from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute and was awarded by the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board for the university's Model Success Program. Prior to UHD, Dr. Muñoz served as the Senior Vice President and Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education and Student Affairs and Senior Vice President for the Diversity, Equity, and Community Engagement at Texas Tech University. Before serving as the university's Chief Diversity Officer, he also served as a full professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction and was an inductee of the Texas Tech Teaching Academy. His research interests examine the education of at-risk students and the learning needs of ethnically and linguistically diverse students. Dr. Muñoz serves on several boards and committees focused on enhancing the Houston's economic and cultural landscapes and national organizations aimed at academic excellence. He is the author of more than 96 book chapters, academic articles, refereed and invited conference presentations. In 2010, Dr. Muñoz was among the contributing editors of the seminal compilation, Handbook of Latinos and Education. His recent text, Perspectives in Interdisciplinary and Integrative Studies, explores disciplinary responses and emerging academic offerings that foster interdisciplinary learnings. Dr. Muñoz earned a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from the University of California at Santa Barbara. After returning from military service in the U.S. Marine Corps during the 1990-91 Gulf crisis, he attended California State University, Los Angeles, where he earned a Master's of Arts degree in Mexican American Studies with an emphasis in literature. He completed his doctorate of philosophy at the University of California of Los Angeles, where he studied curriculum and instruction in the Division of Urban Schooling. Fidelity Investments, as well as myself, is very proud to present the 2020 Equity and Diversity Conference Social Justice Keynote Speaker, Dr. Juan Sánchez Muñoz.
I was apologizing for her having to read all of that. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I want to begin by thanking our signer, who will be working very hard today, so I want to appreciate her efforts. I want to thank Fidelity for introducing me. I appreciate that. I'm also a customer. I believe my deferred compensation is in a Fidelity account. So I want to welcome everyone, say good morning. I want to thank you for this opportunity. And you'll see me going back and forth with my glasses. I'm new to the culture of glass wearing. This job has apparently eroded my vision, but not my sense of humor. So I want to say good morning. I can't, and I want to talk about the title of my remarks. And of course, when you ask a faculty member, or maybe worse, a president, for just a few remarks, they told me I only have 3.5 hours. So I'll be brief. But the wisdom of inclusion, the quality of having experience, knowledge, and good judgment. Inclusion, of course, the act or state of including. I want to say good morning, and I want to say I can't begin to share with you how honored and excited I am to be with you today as part of the 20th anniversary of this conference, a program that seeks to critically invoke what I believe to be among the most vital questions of our day. And there are certainly questions and ideas and issues that, like those of social justice, equity, and diversity, that should be part of one's formal higher education. If we are to truly shape a socially conscious members of an evolving and dynamic democracy, we should ask these questions. And we should be in this moment sometimes of doubt. And there should be universities like this one that gather groups like you to engage these important topics. Allow me to begin my remarks with a quote from one of our most revered voices of the civil rights movement. The title of the Equity Conference is Looking Back. So I'm going to look back in this quote from Mrs. Rosa Parks, who reminded us later in her life, this is a quote later on, I'm leaving this legacy to all of you, all of us, to bring peace and justice, equality, love, a fulfillment of what our lives should be. Without vision, the people will perish, and without courage and inspiration, dreams will die. The dream of freedom and peace will die. As I contemplated her exhortation, it occurred to me that indeed Ms. Parks was challenging us to do precisely what this conference thematically is intended to do, to reflect, to think, to affect, to influence, and to connect with one another. If we are to bring peace, justice, equality, love, and a fulfillment of what our lives should be, the themes of today's conference are inseparable from achieving social justice and everything that one's life should be. Courage and inspiration are the result of context and circumstance, not unlike those being created today by the University of North Texas. So I would be negligent, I think we all would be, not to recognize the leadership of the system and the university, beginning with your Chancellor, Chancellor Rowe. And President Samastres, who couldn't be here with us today, and your Provost Cowley, Jennifer Cowley. She and I, incidentally, were in a leadership program together for a year partnership between Georgetown and Arizona State. And so that's how we first got to know one another. And I knew early on in my interactions with her that she understood diversity, inclusion, equity, fairness. These leaders of your campus and system are no doubt central to the successful implementation of diversity and inclusion at UNT. And they afford colleagues like my friends and a national leader in diversity, Dr. Joanne Woodard, and her staff, Shani Moore, and Teresita Ramos. Ramos? No, para que sepan lo inglés o español. Okay. To organize events like this one today, the 20th anniversary of the Equity and Diversity Conference. And I also want to thank some of the sponsors like Fidelity and Peterbilt, is it? I don't need a tractor right now, just yet, but we might one day. But these organizations, I think, are so important for us to recognize because these conferences don't take place without corporate, private, industry support. But just consider for a moment the time and this topic. 2 decades of leadership in the space of diversity and inclusion. UNT is not new to this. They just didn't show up. They've been evoking these conversations for 2 decades, and that's not insignificant. And that's leadership, and that's courage. So again, I'm honored to be here and to have been invited to offer just a few remarks on the topic of diversity, inclusion, social justice, and I'm going to add at the end of my remarks, leadership. And the importance of having a balanced and informed understanding of how these priorities are both mutually exclusive as well as mutually informing, and how they demand that we reflect, affect, and connect well after today's program. It's not enough to have these dynamic conversations in these kinds of circumstances and contexts, but what we do outside of this room. And so it should come and as no surprise to many of us in Texas, right? That diversity is both present and eminent, not just in this room, but outside of Denton, outside of Arlington, outside of Dallas, outside of Houston, outside of Chicago, outside of Los Angeles. Just a few days ago, this is not necessarily a quote that I would include in my diversity and inclusion remarks, but the current president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, Robert Kaplan, he said in an article just 2 days ago, the article in the Chronicle was called New Strategies Key for Texas Prosperity. And he was quoted, "The economies across the state," this was 2 days ago, "will need to diversify, confront climate change, fix early childhood and K-12 education if the state's productivity is to continue to increase." Just think about the president of the Federal Reserve invoking diversity in the context of prosperity, reflecting on the relationship between K-12 education and the state's well-being, and connecting diverse sets of understanding to the overall prosperity of the state, understanding the relationship between prosperity and equitably distributed opportunities, or otherwise stated, social justice, fairness of opportunity, as inextricable from a future of Texas that flourishes. How do we flourish? How do we prosper in the absence of these considerations? Diversity, fairness, representation, and social justice. Additionally, anyone who's attended a presentation by the eminent scholar Stephen Kleinberg of Rice University, Dr. Kleinberg does a great deal on demographic projections that understands the unique circumstance of diversity in Texas, in Denton, in Dallas, in Arlington, in Flower Mound, in Houston, and take your pick. But he often refers to, in particular, Houston as this prophetic city, one that offers a reliable prediction of the future in terms of its demographics. And he makes the point that of the 8 most diverse metropolitan areas in America, Houston, Harris County, represents a population of just over 6.5 million. It represents the most balanced distribution of major ethnic groups in the country in 2018. But if you examine the distribution of this diversity, And by age group, non-Hispanic whites are the majority of those in the group of 65 and older. All other ethnic groups, mostly of color, are significantly overrepresented in the younger categories. And according to Kleinberg and the U.S. Census, assuming no change in immigration, the percentage of non-whites will continue to grow. In fact, you might be surprised to learn that last year, for the first time in American history, the majority of those entering the first grade in our country were students of color. Diversity is present, but is social justice, is equity, is fairness. According to a colleague of Dr. Woodard at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Dr. Johnson, the diversification of the country is already underway. No force in the universe can stop it. With projections of whites by the year of 2050 at just under 50%, 47%, African Americans essentially at 13%, remaining what they are now. Hispanics just under 30%, Asian Americans just approximately 9-10%. Underrepresented minorities in the future of the United States will represent over 50% of the population, 51%. Incidentally, many of these projections by the census or past demographers and what have you, Kleinberg and others, Murdoch's, have always underestimated the growth of underrepresented minority populations. So if we assume that diversity is present, diversity is imminent, is it the equivalent of inclusion? And is it accompanied by measurable metrics of social justice? This is the challenge. Not just to say that there are substantial numbers, that there are adequate numbers, that there are acceptable numbers, but are these numbers thriving? Are they prospering? Is the story of the American dream and its abundant opportunities equally distributed across the narrative of all American groups? I think this is the question that we have to further ask ourselves in the context of social justice. Are diverse populations of Americans that include ethnic groups, gender, faith, disabled populations, veterans, LGBTQ men and women represented justly, fairly, appropriately across all spaces of commerce, politics, media, industry, education, and the like? How's higher education disrupting? How are we disrupting, evoking classroom and environment which recognizes the value of diversity and the benefits of inclusion? Are classrooms and pedagogies prepared? Are they designed to inculcate an awareness of social justice? Now, let me tell you what I did when I was a young faculty member. Now, I didn't think it was particularly insightful, but I wanted to inculcate in my students an understanding that opportunities, that assets, that high opportunity resources were not equally distributed across a community. So I taught in the College of Education. I taught teachers in curriculum instruction how to design lesson plans, how to design appropriate assessments, how to organize and sequence content for comprehensible input. And it occurred to me that some who wanted to be teachers had never been been to parts of the city that they might be assigned to be teachers at. So I created this activity called asset mapping. And I sent them out to this neighborhood. I said, go to a neighborhood as an assignment that you're unfamiliar with, and I want you to do a map. And do a map of the medical clinics in that neighborhood. Do a map of the laundromats. Do a map of the green spaces. Do a map of is there an optometrist there? Is there a veterinarian there? And lo and behold, these mostly not diverse young teachers, prospective teachers, came back with these stories of how these poor neighborhoods had very little. They had so much less of the things that they thought, because of where in my middle class circumstance, we have these parks, we have access to public transportation, we have hospitals, we have clinics, we have etc. We haven't grocery deserts, we haven't food deserts. So that must be the way everyone lives. Now, at the time, I will tell you, I was a young faculty member. I didn't understand or appreciate the profundity of the activity. It just seemed like a good activity to get them to study where they might work. But over time, this idea of justice and injustice became more and more salient and present in their remarks, as you read in the little quote, of their willingness to exercise agency as teachers and to understand the social context from which their students come, and to understand that poverty is not the equivalent to low ambition or low expectations. That because they come from poor circumstance, it doesn't suggest that they have poor aspirations. And that as a teacher, you have an obligation to invoke all of that aspiration in that young person and understand the circumstances and the limited assets that they come from before you become impatient and critical. So how do we evolve beyond a sense of guilt and compensatory consideration of diversity? To say that diversity, isn't synonymous with deficiency. How do we genuinely value and begin to embrace this idea of the wisdom of inclusion? The wisdom of inclusion. It's not enough to be intelligent. I'm talking about to be wise. The quality of having experience, knowledge, and good judgment, as I read earlier. An elevated understanding of how wisdom inspires justice. How wisdom inspires justice. It invokes representation. It demands opportunity. It exercises grace. And it requires accountability. What are we doing to make things better? James Surowiecki, in his book, The Wisdom of Crowds, makes a profoundly obvious observation. And when I read the book, I thought, this is pretty simple. He wrote a whole book about it. That is that more people from more backgrounds are always able to reach better solutions, including more just solutions. That a village, that a town, that a city, that a country, that a university like UNT, working together historically, has always reached more successful, ambitious, and durable outcomes, and certainly related to social justice. And this quality of durability shouldn't be so quickly glossed over. Social justice, we need to think about durability, permanence. Social justice must be conceptualized as evolutionary. That is, it's fluid but permanent. That it changes, that it adapts, but we never allow social justice to recede. Consider the simplicity of this assumption and how, for many of us, the inclusion of diverse opinions, for example, attitudes and experiences, knowledge, the things that we require to become wise are completely normative in the course of our daily life. Some of us, whether in our conference rooms, like this one, or our kitchen tables, we have conversations with each other. Yes? We have conversations. I say, we argue, we require, how dare you? I can't. You could not have said that. And then we lunch forward. But have you thought about, we react to one another and their counterpoints, hoping to reach some ultimate point of consensus. But sometimes we also agree that no agreement is reached or will be reached at any point. But we are enriched by the exchange. We become wise by the exchange. We reflect, we affect, we connect, we disagree, we present, we argue, we muster, we marshal evidence. And sometimes I can't convince you and you can't convince me, but we are so much better because of our willingness to engage, to connect. We are enhanced by this inclusion, albeit sometimes provocatively, of diverse opinions and the fierce disposition of others. And it is fair, but it is a fair and just debate about meaningful issues that portend to improve the lives of others. I worry, I concern myself about conversations becoming so unpleasant that we disengage from one another. And by disengaging from one another, we separate ourselves from opinions that we might not hold and may not want to hear. But what's the logical conclusion of that separation? We bifurcate our humanity. In Spanish, we say, ¿Qué va a ser el remedio? What's the remedy? ¿Qué remedio nos queda? What do we have left if we go our separate ways? We will most certainly never find some common ground. So to reflect, to affect, and to connect cannot be, in my opinion, exclusively an intellectual exercise. We can't say we're willing to do it, but not with people that disagree with us. Because we become wiser by interacting with others, particularly those that we don't agree with. Social justice is fundamentally an enfleshed human commitment to improving the lives of people. In other words, we must act, acta non verba. Okay? Deeds, not words. How then do the impulses of inclusion and social justice become so difficult to translate into demonstrable change? It's difficult. It's difficult to take these ideas and put them into a program, put them into a practice, put them into a metric, put them into a measurement. But we have to, and progress has been made. In some instances, it's challenging, but just think about today's 20th anniversary. This conference is an example of that progress. Social justice is orchestrating the pathways for full consideration of others, and through full consideration of others, better consideration of self. Inclusion is the restraint. Shani, I thought the directives up for the sort of the ground rules of the conference are wonderful. I took a picture. So if you see it at my university in a couple months, just know that your fingerprints will have been, okay, well done. Inclusion is the restraint and the suspension of judgment. In the interest of being enriched by the perspective of others, inclusion is a statement of confidence. You have to feel confident in your position, in the conviction of your position and its ability to withstand challenge, as well as the strength to potentially adjust your conviction. Is it possible that you think these things should be done and someone may have a better instantiation of that position and your position is changed? You become more wise by listening to others and together you move closer toward your goal? In the face of a more compelling position, are we willing, do you have enough courage and confidence in terms of your definition of social justice to be enhanced by someone else's definition of social justice? Social justice, then, is the willingness to invite this inclusive conversation and to accept the actions that result from it. Because this point of action, I think, is too often overlooked. We've got to do things. We've got to measure things. We've got to create things that lead us toward the thing that we're hoping to achieve. So the principles of diversity and inclusion are fundamental to this idea, and I'm going to get a bit constitutional, of promoting the general welfare of a country enshrined in our Constitution to promote the general welfare of our people. So how then does a country, a state, a city, a school district, a classroom ensure the general welfare of its constituents who, as Ralph Ellison reminds us, many believe themselves to be invisible? Social justice, then, is categorically antithetical to permitting that invisibility. Social justice is antithetical to that invisibility. Diversity and inclusion require our enduring commitment to ensure that all members of society are afforded equitable and demonstrably representational opportunities to prosper. To prosper. Like the Federal Reserve President Kaplan said, prosperity. A society predicated on fairness, opportunity, representation, freedom, and hope. What more can social justice be than, as Rosa Parks reminded us, the fulfillment of what our lives should be? And I believe, as I hope that you do, that the American dream of this fulfillment, our collective American promise, is hardly on life support. I've been doing this work of diversity and inclusion for decades. I was a founding board member of NADIHI, the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Ed, well over a decade ago. And in my experience, people committed to diversity, equity, representation, and social justice have to be optimists. You can't be a pessimist in this work. You got to be about the life of optimism. You got to be about that life. Okay? Because this is hard work, y'all. Y'all, you know, back in my neighborhood said, you know, y'all better bring a lunch. We're going to be about the life, and there are no breaks. So, this American dream, and yes, imperfect justice, okay, present within our democratic experience, still continues to reside in the lives and living rooms of millions of us every day. Imperfect as it is, but aspirational nonetheless. I go to high schools as a university president almost every week. I try to go almost every week. I said when I moved from Lubbock to Houston, in Lubbock there are 4 high schools. I said I'll visit every high school. So when I took a job in Houston, I said I'll visit every high school within 50 miles of the university. See, y'all, now my West Texas is coming out. You know the geography of Houston better than I did when I made that statement, which was actually captured and immortalized in an article in the Houston Chronicle. So it keeps getting referenced. How far along are you? So there are a couple hundred. I think I'm like on high school 48 or something. And if you go into these classrooms and you meet with these young people and these teachers and these counselors and these assistant principals and their families, they're optimistic. They are. They're encouraged. They're not blind. They see the things that are happening, but they want a better life. They're optimistic. Millions across our country remain committed to this preservation of justice, inclusion, and the spirit of e pluribus unum, out of many one. But I would also add that demographics alone and diversity are not destiny. They're not destiny just to have in many of us. Groups committed to the principles of social justice must be prepared, and here is among my final points. Positions of leadership. We must be prepared to assume the challenges of leadership and the burden of decision making and the consequence of failure with clarity, with resolve, and with wisdom. These are difficult, challenging issues, and we are going to fail, and we have to support one another. We have to prop one another up. We have to insulate one another. We have to bring one another up. We have to exercise grace, but we have to lead. We have to step into the arena. We have to take the damaging blows. We have to create, through courage, the context like UNT is doing this morning to have these conversations. And we've got to reach out to partners like Fidelity and other corporations and say, this is part of your obligation as well. También tienen obligación. You're part of this community. We educate this community. You must be not in the community, but of the community. I'm about to hand out that basket, y'all. Collecting money for scholarships. Many of us are familiar with the variety of leadership styles, and you've heard many of them. They include top-down and bottom-up, authentic leadership, consultative, collaborative, and of course, often we hear servant leadership. I think this one is closest to the work that we do. As educators, educar. That is, ultimately, in this line of work, that these approaches to leadership emphasize different skills and competencies and dispositions, often learned at institutions like UNT, but they share something in common. That is, that they are ultimately directed toward a goal that require the themes of this conference. To lead, one has to exercise reflection. To lead, one has to understand affection. And to lead, one has to deliberately engineer connection. Then how then does one engage? How do you engage? How do you listen? How do you consult? How do you collaborate? Or how do you serve others if as a leader of a group, you're oblivious to its diversity, its background, its thoughts, its disposition, its inclination, or the possible wisdom that the diverse people you purport to represent might bring to bear on a problem? The wisdom of crowd is suspended. It's abdicated if you never interact with the crowd. How do you lead in the absence of understanding those that you purport to be a part of and whose lives you want to improve? Diversity, inclusion, and social justice, it demands that you put yourself in a position to prepare yourself to represent the wisdom of the crowd. And you can't do that from a distance. As a leader, you yourself have failed to reflect, and this is something that often we fail to do. If you fail to reflect an awareness of your own diversity, as well as that of others, how can you then achieve that rare quality of authenticity? I remember in West Texas one time, I tell this story. It's funny in 2020, but it wasn't funny in 1978. I talked about standing in line for government cheese. Y'all don't know. You don't remember? Yeah. That consignment cheese. It doesn't break down in the microwave. You know what I'm talking about? Who knows what I'm talking about? Raise your hand. Don't be, like, you know what I'm talking about. I remember they tell, the moms, they got on that communication tree, the moms, they're handing out that cheese, right? So we went to this facility to go get some cheese. There were a lot of us, a lot of brown kids. I grew up in a little area called East LA. People nowadays, they say, I grew up in Huntington Beach. I said, what part? They go, East LA? Okay. I grew up in East LA. And in East LA, at night, they were handing out cheese, and my mom took all 6 of us. So she put us in line. Okay, there were those blocks of cheese. Remember that brown government? Yeah, that's right. I remember getting in line and getting that cheese, right? And I came back after the march of shame. I came back, and my mom said, take your shirt off, get back in line. I told her in Spanish, Ma, this is not like Superman. I'm not like the Green Lantern. This isn't a costume that I take my shirt off, they won't recognize me. She goes, just go do it. So we brought home 12 boxes of cheese, lasted all year. Okay. That stuff doesn't process. I'm sure I got some down over here somewhere. I told that story in West Texas, and this big old cowboy, he looked nothing like Juan Muñoz from East LA. He was from Dumas. He said, that's a good story, boy. I said, was it, sir? He goes, uh-huh. When my mama put me in line, it was for butter and bread. See, he had gone through something similar. Different, but similar. So, how do you develop that authenticity? How can you as young leaders connect toward a more just society in the absence of this kind of diversity of experience, of the inclusion of others, and the wisdom that results from it? One of the characteristics of UNT, I'm going to brag a little bit about your university, that I've long admired is its tenacious commitment to today's students, and of creating a space where, as stated, I want you to know I did my homework, stated in UNT's current president report, page 11, paragraph 2. I did my work, y'all. Quote, students are encouraged, so here the students can write this down. Students are encouraged to nurture your own revolutionary point of view. Revolutionary point of view. Because even if you don't realize it yet, you're going to change the world. Your attention and dedication to the challenges of a just society guarantee that you will indeed change the world. Prepare yourself to proffer provocative questions, to require measurement and metrics of change. Just don't rhetorically believe the change is happening. Ask for some proof. Be judicious consumers of data and speak truth to power and truth to the powerless. Don't assume that because they're poor, they're unintelligent. Speak truth to power as well as to the powerless, and animate them to exercise their agency in their own extrication of that poverty. And you will change the world. For my part, events like this one demonstrates a clarion understanding of the value of diversity, equity, and the imperativeness of wisdom if we are to realize authentic, sustainable, durable social justice. Today's participants, all of you, are authentic leaders in this evolving narrative of diversity, inclusion, and social justice. And with this burden, because when you step into the arena, you have to accept that burden of leadership that UNT, its students and leaders have accepted. We are again reminded of the words of Miss Parks, and I quote, because to me this is just some basic practical wisdom. What really matters is not that we have problems. Y'all know we have problems, right? But how we go through them. Ms. Park said, how we go through them. We must keep going on to make it through whatever we are facing. There's wisdom in persistence and dedication and focus. Today's conference affirms our commitment to face our challenges, to acknowledge our problems, to illuminate our injustices no matter where they are, and make it through to a better future. And we will, because of your courage to reflect, to affect, and your willingness to come here today to connect with one another. So I want to thank you for your time, for your hope, and most importantly, your wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Muñoz, for dropping the mic, as we knew that you would when we invited you here. And so now we have time for one question. So James, what do you have for us?
Hello, yes. We got a tweeted question from Devin West. He asks, how do you create inclusion for people with disabilities who are also under more recognized marginalizations, race, class, language, etc.? Mi propietita es de México y ella es ciega.
Okay. Read it one more time, young man.
Oh, yeah, no problem. How do you create inclusion for people with disabilities who are also under more recognized marginalizations?
Well, in higher education, I'm sure that you probably have officers, directors of student affairs offices, counseling services, disability services, etc. We're higher ed. The good news, of course, is because more people are attending higher education, they're also presenting with different abilities, mobility issues, auditory issues, visual issues, and the professionals required to provide those kinds of services, they're not inexpensive. The technologies, ally training, blackboard modifications in order for curriculum to be fully accessible, to be able to hear it. We're having to train faculty in order to redesign their curriculum and the materials that they place online for people with different abilities. There's also the challenge, many veterans are now coming back out of uniformed service, and they have mobility issues because of different injuries. And we simply, again, to me, this is absolutely an issue of justice. We have to create the same opportunities for those with disabilities and many that are disabled and also members of underrepresented or low-income populations populations have even fewer resources available to them. And often they come from families where they don't have the vocabulary, right, the understanding of how to access the resources that exist. And sometimes they feel shame about taking advantage of the resources that exist on public university campuses for their benefit. But they're apprehensive, they're reluctant, and so we've got to create an environment where students understand this. When I visit high schools, public schools, elementary, middle schools, I tell them this is a public university. Your families have already endowed you with this opportunity. It is our responsibility at the university to make sure that you fully subscribe to all of the services and resources that your family have already prepared for you. And so we've got to be mindful, but I think it also comes from managers, directors, vice presidents, assistant vice presidents, deans of students, and ultimately presidents and chancellors, to make sure that the expectation regarding the services for disabled population, those with limited mobility, etc., that the expectations for them are just as high as for any other student on our campus. And I would just say that I don't know of anyone in my line of work or in my particular professional category that is incognizant of the growing population of those with various disabilities that are fortunately entering higher education. That's off the cuff.
Dr. Muñoz, we thank you for being here with us and gracing us with your presence for this historic occasion. Join me in giving another hand to Dr. Juan Sánchez Muñoz.